Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Pathfinder Kingmaker. This goes over the original release of the game, which is what I started playing with this, as well as the Enhanced Edition update, the Wildcards DLC, which is the only DLC for this game I have completed, along with Beneath the Stolen Lands, which is only going to get some brief coverage, and the Varnhold's Lot DLC, which I'm not really going to talk about much because by the time I got around to trying Varnhold's Lot, all of my enthusiasm for Pathfinder Kingmaker had completely died. And it's pretty strange going into this video because this game has been something of a roller coaster in terms of how I've felt about it as I've been playing it. Because going into it, I was actually fairly excited. This was the first real adaptation of the Pathfinder rule set as well as the Pathfinder universe into a proper CRPG, and moreover, it was adapting one of the most iconic Pathfinder adventure paths, which is, of course, Kingmaker. And on top of all of that, it had Chris Avallone contributing to the writing of it. Of course, this was before all of those allegations and such came out about him, but it doesn't really matter. His writing chops are undeniable. Owlcat Games themselves seemed rather enthusiastic about the game. It had that whole successful Kickstarter campaign going for it, and the game did fully release, and of course, people were pretty excited about it. But then we actually got our hands on the game, and that's when problems started to arise almost immediately, and the responses to those problems were a bit of a mess. You see, on the one hand, the game had a huge amount of technical problems, both in terms of bugs and glitches, as well as weird performance issues that would come up here and there, and really long loading times. But while those technical issues were annoying, they certainly weren't deal breakers. They were the kind of thing where you looked at it and you go, okay, this game is a bit of a mess right now, but this is all stuff that can be fixed, and of course Owlcat is working on patches, so we can wait for that to be fixed before we render full judgment on technical problems. But there was also a major elephant in the room, and that was the game's balancing. Now, this was an interesting topic when the game originally released, because there were quite a few people out there who seemed to think that the game was perfectly fine, and that anybody who had any issues with the balancing was just a whiner who needed to get good at Pathfinder. But here's the thing, whenever a roll is made in Pathfinder Kingmaker, it shows you what the actual calculation for the roll was, what you rolled on the d20 as well as whatever modifiers you were adding to it, minus any penalties that you had, of course, as well as the difficulty number for that particular roll, or if you were rolling an attack roll, then it would be whatever the armor class of the opponent you were going up against was, or of course their saving throw numbers. And people were looking at those and going, whoa, these numbers are completely insane. We're talking low challenge rating enemies that have stats way higher than they should be compared to the tabletop game. And after some experimentation and looking at the way the game was doing these stat increases, they found out that any of the difficulty settings higher than the easy difficulty setting just threw a ton of padding into the enemy's stats to make the game more difficult. Well, the mission was accomplished there, it made it more difficult, the problem was it was completely unfair about the way it did it, and it basically was like if you were playing with a really terrible DM. Those of you who've played tabletop games will know the kind of dungeon master I'm talking about. The kind that goes into every session wanting a TPK and just inflates the stats of whatever you're going up against, or throws you against completely absurd odds at the very beginning, and then expresses bewilderment when you get mad at him for doing something like that. In fact, that probably explains where all of the you just need to get good at Pathfinder crap came from. But anyway, the point was that the difficulty balancing options at the onset were completely borked. So if you were playing this thing like I was on the normal difficulty setting, you would have gone into the game knowing how to play Pathfinder and finding yourself being completely curb-stomped by pretty much everything the game was throwing at you, all the while wondering what the hell you were doing wrong, because you were doing things like using potions and scrolls, you were using your buff spells, you were trying to hit the enemy with the spells that would do the most damage, and it was barely even scratching them if it did anything at all. And every single time your guys would try to hit something, it would just constantly miss, no matter how high they rolled. and whenever the enemy would attack you, they would always seem to hit you and do massive damage. And what made it even worse was when you went in and messed around with the difficulty settings and put it down to the easy settings, you found that even on the easy settings, it still didn't match up with the tabletop. Nothing in this game actually matched properly with the tabletop stats. And you have to understand that adventure paths in Pathfinder, or of course campaign books in Dungeons & Dragons, or whatever your additional tabletop RPG of choice is, are designed in such a way that when you start out the campaign, you are almost certainly going to be at level 1, maybe level 2, unless it's a very high level campaign, in which case they will start you off at a higher level. And the encounters are designed in such a way to where the party is supposed to be at a certain level by the time they get to that point, and even if they aren't, there are going to be ways for them to swing things in their favor. And the Kingmaker adventure path was no exception there. Owlcat looked at that and thought that those stats were too low, so they raised them in the PC game, thus resulting, even on the easy difficulty setting, with the stats being bloated compared to the tabletop books that this was based on. Now here's the thing, if you're the kind of player who min-maxes the living crap out of your characters, that's not that big of a deal, because you were going to be doing that anyway, and you're probably going to be able to go into this game and find pretty much no problems with it. That's a really small minority of the tabletop RPG and the CRPG communities. So you basically have this really small minority who are like, wow, this game's great. And then the rest of us were like, guys, can you fix this so it's more like the tabletop? And then the people who are min-maxing are like, no, it's great. You guys just suck at the game. You need to get better at it. So you have a bit of a back and forth between the people who think that it's perfectly fine and the people who clearly see the real problems here. And eventually, Owlcat does put out some balancing tweaks here and there, and eventually it gets closer to the tabletop. But it's still not completely accurate to the stats you would actually be seeing in the tabletop books. They are still bloated a bit, and that does make certain combat encounters pretty irritating. In fact, it eventually got so irritating that I would have these peaks and valleys in terms of game challenge, where it would go from being complete pushover to suddenly absurdly difficult at the drop of a hat, that eventually I just said, fuck it, and put the game on the story difficulty setting, which basically turns almost the entire game into an absolute cakewalk where you won't be challenged in the slightest. Except, here's the thing about that. Even with the current updates in the game, that's not entirely true. You can't play through the game on the story difficulty mode and just enjoy the story, because the end game exists. And I would describe the end game in Pathfinder Kingmaker as borderline abject cruelty. It is not designed to be a challenge. It is not designed to be something that tests your mettle. It is designed to weed out the people who are not min-maxing the living fuck out of the game. Because you will see plenty of people who did min-max the fuck out of the game going, oh no, it's absolutely easy, what are you talking about? And if you decide to play it like, I don't know, any other normal role-playing game, you will get completely demolished. Because not only is the endgame just a tedious slog, but it is a tedious slog through hordes of enemies where it throws a lot of them at you at once, all of whom have concealment, meaning that if you succeeded an attack roll, it doesn't really matter because 50% of the time you're not going to hit them anyway. Most of the enemies have some form of attribute drain attacks, and some of the enemies even have level drain attacks. Not to mention that all of these enemies can attack you quite rapidly. Most of them have extremely high attack rolls, meaning that it doesn't really matter what your armor class is, you're going to get hit anyway. And the target difficulties of all of the checks you're going to be having to make to succeed on saving throws are so high that chances are you're probably going to fail most of those anyway, meaning that any of the attacks that cause level drain, or attribute drain, or the various debuff effects are probably going to succeed against you. You will constantly see people who have gone through this game saying, oh no, you just need to prepare properly. It's all a matter of getting all the right buffs and all the right potions and scrolls and everything. And they'll also say things like, oh, by the time you get to that, you'll be so high level you'll be able to handle it. Thing is, the game still has a massive difficulty spike at the end game. One that you're really not prepared for unless you have been cognizant of all of the discourse around the game. And by the time you've gotten to the house at the edge of time, chances are, depending on how you've played the game, you're going to be pretty close to the 100-hour mark. I got to about 87 hours by the time I got to the House of the Edge of Time, and I really wasn't having any fun with the game by that point. I had gone through all of the companion quests, I had gone through the vast majority of all of the important quests, except for, of course, the story itself, and while a lot of those had some very interesting writing and some interesting moments to them, and those had kept me going throughout the latter portions of the game, the last chapter of the game is basically nothing but combat, because by that point you've done pretty much all of the major quests in the game, so the only things left to you are the very basic side quests that were just generic, or you'll have to go around exploring generic locations, and I actually recorded footage of going through numerous locations that I had discovered on the map, and finding that the layouts of the areas were exactly the same for many of them. It's just that they swapped around what enemies you were fighting in them. It was giving off some pretty heavy Dragon Age 2 vibes there, except that the combat in Dragon Age 2 was considerably more exciting and fast-paced than the combat in Pathfinder Kingmaker is. I said it before in my real-time with pause combat video, but real-time with pause combat really only works well when you have a small party, maybe 3 or 4 characters, and you're going up against small parties of enemies. It does not work very well when you have a full party of 6 characters going up against hordes of enemies that outnumber them 2 to 1 half the time. The character pathfinding, pun sort of intended, ends up just kind of shitting itself at that point, and you end up with a blob of your guys fighting a blob of the enemy, and it's hard to tell exactly what's going on, especially if you have all this text popping up on the screen interfering with what you're actually able to see. And that text is all on top of just tons of spell effects being fired off, tons of blood and gore spraying all over the place from all of the melee combat. It just ends up being a mess. Cue people saying, well, if it were in turn-based, it'd be even more of a slog. Well, yeah, because switching the game from real-time with pause to turn-based combat doesn't fix the encounter design. Anyway, I've rambled enough about the encounter design and the endgame combat just dragging the game to a screeching halt, more or less. The problem isn't so much that it's just the endgame that does this, though. The entire game is packed to the gills with combat, and it just becomes incredibly tedious incredibly quickly, to the point where, again, I said fuck it and turned the game over to story mode, just so the combat would go by more quickly and I could get it over with to get to the stuff that was actually interesting. Because weirdly enough, all of the really interesting stuff in Pathfinder Kingmaker is not in its gameplay. The gameplay overall is actually pretty boring for the most part. I've already rambled about the combat, but it's even things like the kingdom management, which should be pretty interesting. I mean, it's not something you normally see in a role-playing game, but the way they've done it here, it just becomes a time management game more than anything else, and a lot of the events that come up just have absurdly high difficulties, to the point where they're basically impossible to succeed at unless you spend a huge number of crisis points on them, and you don't get very many crisis points. All of these events have a certain number of days that are required to complete them. While they're in action, the advisor you've picked to handle that event will not be available to handle any other events that come up, which is an issue if a problem event comes up that only they can solve. Problem events cause negative things to happen to your kingdom if they are not solved, or if the advisor that is sent to complete them actually fails at them. And like most things in this game, the success or failure of an event is determined by whether or not a roll of a d20 plus whatever the modifiers that particular advisor has manages to meet or exceed the difficulty number of that particular event. The thing is, if it's not one of the problem or opportunity events that comes up, then you can send your advisors on a variety of projects that will enhance your kingdom in certain ways. Maybe they'll give you a certain bonus while you're in certain territories, or they will give you certain bonuses to the kingdom itself so that the kingdom will get better resources or will improve its capabilities or things like that. And some of these things require you to accompany the advisor for the full amount of time of that particular project, and so if there's something that goes horribly wrong while you're on that project, well, too bad, you're just gonna have to deal with it. And that's especially fun when a story event rolls around while you're in the middle of doing something else, and thus it starts wreaking havoc on your kingdom without you being able to do anything about it because you're in the middle of doing a project. You see, the entire game is on a timer of sorts. There are certain events that will trigger with the story that you have to deal with, and those will happen in between long periods where you can do a bunch of kingdom management, general adventuring, so on and so forth. And this results in two effects. The first of these is that when the story events come up, they will disrupt whatever plans you were making beforehand, because if you don't go and complete those story events, then you get a game over. So obviously you're going to drop whatever you were doing and go do the story events. Once you've done that, then it's back to the long period of going through kingdom management and going through general adventuring and trying to deal with all these other things that keep popping up, but then all of a sudden you'll get another story event and you'll have to drop everything and go do that instead. Now obviously the idea there is that they are trying to create a sense of urgency, a sense that the story is moving along whether you want it to or not, so unlike other RPGs where you can set the main story aside and go do side content to your heart's content, here you need to be cognizant that the main story is an important part of the game. And while the method they go about trying to achieve this is certainly very irritating, it is commendable that they did try to drive home the idea that the story is actually important. The things that are going on in the story could have devastating effects on your kingdom, and you do need to deal with them. But as I mentioned, the way they went about doing it is certainly irritating, and the second effect that has is that the pacing of the story is actually pretty glacial. There are long segments of the game where you are just sitting around waiting for things to happen, so if you manage to get to those moments and you don't have very many side quests because you've completed most of them, then you can have long sequences where you're just stuck doing projects and waiting for time to advance. Or if you don't even have projects or can't afford to complete them at any given moment, you might just be stuck sitting there skipping days. So you're going back and forth wildly between moments where you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs more or less, and suddenly all hell's breaking loose and you have to deal with this thing right now, and if you don't deal with it right now, then it's game over. And between that and the horribly unbalanced combat, you're probably going to be saving like an absolute madman the entire time you're playing this thing. Because if you mess something up and it ends up getting a game over, or you end up losing a combat encounter, you're going to have to load your save, go back to the moment before you did that thing, and do it all over again. And if you forgot to save for a while, then, well, good luck with that. There is an autosave system, and it is fairly generous, but those autosaves still only occur on certain intervals, so you're going to still be saving like crazy if you want to not lose any progress. Thing is, you're probably still going to lose progress no matter how hard you try. And if the content were really interesting and engaging, then that'd be one thing, but the vast majority of content in this game is just okay at absolute best. I mean, sure, the companion characters are actually pretty damn good, and their storylines are actually rather interesting and keep you engaged throughout, but the main story of the game? Well, I mean, it's an adaptation of a tabletop adventure path, and that adventure path is pretty decent, but it's not an amazing story by any stretch of the imagination. Aside from that, the rest of the game is mostly just filler content. It's not all bad or anything, don't get me wrong, some of the quests are just dull MMO-style crap, but there are a few quest lines in the game that actually have some fairly interesting stories to them. There's some mystery, there's definitely a lot of opportunity for role-playing, in the sense that you can have a lot of dialogue options based on your skills, as well as dialogue options based on alignment, and based on the alignment options you choose, you can actually steer your own character's alignment in different directions, and of course your party members will react differently depending on what you do. So not only is all of that quite welcome, but it actually makes this a proper role-playing game instead of just a game calling itself an RPG, and you are given a metric ton of options to play around with throughout the game, from things like the difficulty settings, which you can actually do a custom difficulty setting if you really want to, and customize each individual aspect of it. You have tons of options for statting out your character, although you are still stuck using the obnoxious Pathfinder point buy system, which I know a lot of people swear by because they like to min-max the living crap out of their characters, but I have always hated point buy in especially Pathfinder, but also just RPGs in general, especially D20 based ones. I mean, if it's a video game, I'll put up with it, or if it's a system in tabletop form that just doesn't have any sort of random generation, I'll have to put up with it. But if I have the option, I'm always going to want to roll stats. In fact, if you think about it, rolling for stats would actually be a pretty massive advantage to have in this particular game, since you basically are predicated on being maxed out at your stats even at level 1 if you're playing on any difficulty higher than the easiest. But no, we're stuck with a system that basically forces you to do one of two things. Either effectively turn your character into generic example of insert character type here, or you min-max the living shit out of your character and you end up with something that can actually function in this game. And I think that's ultimately what stands out to me the most about Pathfinder Kingmaker. It's not that it's overwhelmingly a bad game or even overwhelmingly a good game. It has a lot of elements that I really like. For example, the idea of kingdom management, although the execution wasn't particularly good, as well as the extensive options for customizing your character and the options for steering dialogue in different directions based on your character's alignment or what alignment you're trying to steer them towards, as well as what your skills are and what the skills of your party members are. And while the implementation is a bit rough, it's great that the game tries to implement consequences for the player's actions and tries to work the story in there instead of having the story be its own thing and the player being free to just go off and do whatever the hell they want without any consequence. The characters in your party are actually surprisingly interesting and have rather fleshed out character arcs throughout the entire game, so that's also great. And it's great that they tried to work in 2 of the 3 major DLCs as major story content. For example, the Wildcards gives you an entire new party member, or technically 2 party members, but there's story behind that and I don't want to spoil too much of that for you. And of course the Varnhold's Lot DLC is basically an interlude in the story that provides additional context for things that actually do come up in the main story and which you will deal with the aftermath of. So they clearly put quite a bit of time and effort into making sure that those 2 DLCs at least were actually fitting for the game. And of course, as a bit of a cherry on top of all of that, this is the first major implementation of the classic Pathfinder rule set as well as the Pathfinder universe in a proper party-based RPG, so it's great to see that. Unfortunately, the game ultimately just has a few major issues that ultimately drag the entire experience down. And before I start talking about those, I do want to mention that the Beneath the Stolen Lands DLC is just fairly ambivalent. It's just a roguelite dungeon crawl. There's not really much to it. You just go from floor to floor, you fight a bunch of enemies, you move to the next floor, repeat ad nauseum, basically. Obviously, that doesn't really do much for me in this particular game, so I got to the first of the boss fights in it, and then just decided that was enough and stopped messing around with it. So that DLC doesn't really do much to drag the game down, it's just mildly disappointing at worst. But the real things that drag this game down to the depths are simply that the game is horrendously unbalanced. If you're playing on any difficulty higher than the easy mode, it is just a complete curb stomp and not in your favor, unless you min-max. And that ultimately leads me to my main conclusion about Pathfinder Kingmaker. This was not a game that was designed for Pathfinder fans or even fans of CRPGs in general. Because sure, Pathfinder is based on Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition and it is pretty stat heavy. But it's not that hard to understand and it's not that difficult to get into as long as you're playing it in a more casual mindset. But there are people out there who take it way too seriously and go way too hard into all the meticulous statcraft. And in case you haven't actually played a tabletop RPG before, you may not understand this, but those are the kind of people who actually ruin the experience for everybody else at the table unless the entire table is full of people with that exact same mindset. And it seems like Owlcat, rather than just understanding that that was going to be a reality with their game and planning accordingly with higher difficulty modes for those people, instead seemed to design the entire game around that mindset, which in turn completely alienates people who don't have that mindset. And what makes it worse is that people who have that mindset tend not to understand or just straight up don't care that the vast majority of the RPG community isn't going to really get much out of that. Sure, RPG players like having better stats, they like having better gear, and so on and so forth. You could frankly just say the same about really any game in existence, actually, and the people who play those. But in particular with RPGs, because there is a lot of loot and there are a lot of stats, you would think that the people who play them would be very heavy into stats. The reality is, the vast majority of us aren't into stats. We just view all of that number crunching as a tool to create interesting scenarios, to create drama, to create tension. And when that combines with the narrative and the shared storytelling of an RPG, that's what creates such an interesting experience when you sit down to play a tabletop RPG, or to a slightly lesser extent a CRPG. In fact, balancing the stats carefully is considerably more important in a CRPG, because once the stats are there in the CRPG, you can't change them without patching the game. That's what makes a dungeon master or a game master, depending on what system you're running, so important in a tabletop game. They can go in there and adjust things behind the scenes without the players even knowing it. If they're going up against something that they have absolutely no chance of beating, then the DM can sit there and go, okay, well, let's introduce some extra elements here so that the players can actually get out of this thing alive. But with a CRPG, you can't really do that. Everything's set in stone. So if you come up to an encounter and you have to go through this encounter in order to progress the game, and that encounter is just straight up unfair to the player, there's no recourse there. You can try lowering the difficulty, but if you're already on a lower difficulty setting and the game is still completely stomping on you and you're doing everything in your power to remedy the problem, well, the game's attitude at that point is basically, sucks to be you, load an old save or just restart the game entirely. And while you're going to go into a game like this expecting to have to use buff spells and potions and things of that nature to make sure that you've got your characters up and ready to go for a particularly difficult fight, when you have to do that for almost every single encounter in the game, and there are so damn many combat encounters in this game, you eventually just get sick of it. And that's what ultimately happened to me. I eventually hit the point where I just got so damn sick of the combat in this game that I just switched the difficulty down to the lowest possible and breezed through pretty much every single combat encounter from then on out. At least until I got to the end game and they introduced the massive difficulty spike, and I was still sick of the combat by that point. So I ultimately just said, fuck it is not worth finishing, stopped playing the game, looked at my hour count, and beheld that it was 87 hours. And at that point, I still probably had a few hours left to go before the game's story was finally done. I looked around to get an idea of roughly how long people's playthroughs of Pathfinder Kingmaker end up being, and I saw as a conservative estimate going purely on main story alone, being around 80 hours, and then if you do extra content, just an average playthrough, it's closer to 100 to 125 hours. That is a really long time to have to put up with the game's shortcomings, and if you're not somebody who just obsesses over stats in RPGs, you're probably going to make yourself miserable by the end of it, and you're just going to end up not enjoying the experience overall. If you're somebody who obsesses over stats in RPGs, pick up Pathfinder Kingmaker. You will absolutely love it. But if you're somebody who just goes into RPGs to enjoy a good story or enjoy good character interactions and such like that, Pathfinder Kingmaker does have those, but it's buried underneath the super stat-heavy gameplay that will just completely ruin the experience for people who are not into that excessive number crunching. And I have to say that with what this game exhibited, I am very concerned for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, which is the follow-up to this, because they are going into the mythic side of things with Wrath of the Righteous, and that introduces a whole other set of stats and such that you have to worry about, and if they've got that going on, then chances are it's going to be even more excessively number crunchy than this particular game is. So hopefully they'll learn from their mistakes and they'll actually balance things properly with that one. And while I'll reserve judgment on that game until it's actually out and I get a chance to play it myself, because I am still kind of looking forward to it, even though this game was such a massive letdown for me, I'm not gonna hold my breath on Wrath of the Righteous, let's put it that way. But there you have it, folks. My thoughts on Pathfinder Kingmaker. Sorry it's taken me so long to get any video out on it at all, but now you know why it's taken me so long to get a video out on it, and it's one of those games where I really wanted to like it, but I just can't because there's one or two glaring flaws that just drag the entire thing down and make it miserable for me to try to play the damn thing. I know people have this incredibly idiotic notion that I go into every single game wanting to hate it or specifically looking for things to hate about it, but I don't do that. In fact, with this particular game, it was one of my most anticipated titles for the year it came out. I was really looking forward to Pathfinder Kingmaker, and then I go and play it, and it's designed in such a way to where I just can't enjoy it, despite there being quite a few things in the game that I really, really liked. It's just immensely frustrating, and it's not like, say, Pillars of Eternity, where I was really looking forward to that game too, but playing that thing is like trying to read a dictionary. It's just so damn boring most of the time because the dialogue is just so full of exposition dumps. No, Pathfinder Kingmaker has interesting writing. It's fun when that stuff is front and center, but then you go and play... Anyway, I'm done rambling for this particular video, so thank you all very much for watching. Thanks for putting up with the delays on it and everything like that. And if you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Everything from that goes directly back into the channel, and if you can't afford to support the channel on Patreon or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. Just the options there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'm going to get back to making other videos, which I will see you all in next time.